team or underwater. They found no wreckage and no signs of any vehicle that had fallen from the ridge into the concrete span was eventually demolished in 2005 to make way for a newer and safer steel. Workers during the demolition reported hearing the sound of a phone ringing inside the hollow pillars of the. They also found a collection of personal items, including watches and rings, that dated back to the 1920s. These items were found embedded deep within the concrete as if they had been placed there when building. The most disturbing find was a set of human footprints that led into a solid wall, and then the story of the forest shortcut remains a part of the local lore that people share during winter. The voicemail that Silas Vance left for his sister was the last time anyone heard his natural voice today. He sounded calm and told her that he was finally going to see the city that everyone was talking. He mentioned that the bus was on time and that the driver was a very old friend of. The recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of the people who still live in the. It is a voice from the center of a storm that should have never been able to reach. We are left with the silence of the forest and the memory of a road that led nowhere. The journey into the white is a journey that we all must take when the signal is. The shadows are just waiting for the next deep freeze so they can show us the way back. The shortcut is gone, but the crossing is still there for those who know how to find. The regional forest supervisor ordered the area around the Iron Gate to be fenced off with heavy chain link. He claimed it was due to soil erosion, but the locals knew that the reason was much more. People who live near the base of the mountain say they still hear the humming sound on televisions. It happens most often during the first week of January when the air is still and the sun. They say it is the sound of Silas Vance still trying to radio for help from the other. The mountain keeps its silent vigil over the valley, and the pines whisper the names of those who. If you ever find a compass spinning in circles near a trail, you should turn around and walk. The warning from the logbook is still true, even if the man who wrote it is no longer. The shadows are always waiting for the right moment to step out and take what they feel. The final report from the county coroner was issued in 1985 and noted a strange lack. He stated that the lack of biological traces at the site suggested that Silas had simply ceased to. This conclusion was rejected by the state police, who believed that the mechanic had staged his own strange. They pointed to his clean bank records and his lack of personal debt as evidence that he stayed. However, his sister claimed that Silas was a man of high integrity who would never abandon his job. She kept the tape recorder from his truck in a safe place and listened to it every winter. She said that if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a forest fire today. The mystery remains a part of the local lore that keeps the tourists away from the high ridge. A structural engineer who visited the site in 2010 found that the magnetic field was highly. He suggested that a massive energy discharge had occurred within the stone foundation during the peak of storm. Silas Vance was buried in the town cemetery, but his name is often whispered by those who fear. The story of the shortcut is a reminder that the woods hold secrets that we are not meant. We build our roads to cross the world, but sometimes the world is watching us from the deep. The silence of the forest is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave. Sometimes the truth is colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple. It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of mountain. What Silas discovered after forcing the frozen gate was a man who had found his way back home. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the winter. The mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police. We will remember the name of Silas Vance and the night the gray mist came inside to stay. The wind is picking up again and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks. It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices today. The story is finished and the narrator is tired and the lights are starting to fade out. Good night to the valley and to the ridge and to the people who are still waiting there. The cold truth remains buried beneath the ice and the stone and the memory of the man who. We are just the listeners to an echo of a life that was taken by the wind today. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place where he finally. The warning was real, and the cost was his life, but he seems to have found peace. We will keep the records safe, and we will remember the name of the man who walked. The forest is waiting for the next winter to clear so it can show us something new. The story of Silas Vance is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the day. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that changed the history of the entire Northern Valley for the truth is often colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing today. The shortcut remains a quiet chapter in the history of the valley that no one wants to read. We build over the past, but the past has a way of reaching up and pulling us down. The mystery of the forest road is a silent witness to the power of the cold, and it remains a quiet chapter in the history of the valley that no one wants to read out. The new highway is monitored by several high-definition cameras, but the footage is often corrupted today. Technicians say the interference is caused by a magnetic source located deep within the earth below the woods. Some locals refuse to cross the area after the sun goes down, and they take the long. They know that the snow can hide things that we are not meant to see in light. The story of the road is a reminder that our structures are only as strong as the final report from the structural engineers noted that the concrete had a high concentration of unknown organic. They suggested that the shortcut was not just a road, but a living part of the mountain. This finding was ignored by the state board, who wanted to move forward with the new project today. They buried the old path in a deep pit and covered it with a layer of heavy. The site is now a quiet meadow where the grass grows tall and the birds sing today. But the humming remains, and the red lights still flicker deep beneath the surface of the black. If you find yourself on the road during a storm, you should keep your eyes on the fog. Do not look at the fog and do not stop for any lights that you see. The shortcut is always there, even when it is gone from the world we see. The journey into the white is a journey that everyone must take when the time is finally. The shadows are just waiting for the light to fade so they can show you the way. The mechanic is still out there, and he is watching the trees to make sure no one. The story ends here in the quiet of the office where the files are stored today. We can only wonder what Silas saw in the clearing and why he chose to stay there. The mountain knows the answer, and the pines are not telling anyone what they have seen today. We are just listeners to the echo of a life that was taken by the snow. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place today. The warning was real, and the cost was his life, but he found his home. The cedar trees are the only ones that know the full story of what happened to the day. They stand tall against the wind and the snow while they watch the shadows move in the voicemail Silas left for his truck was never found by the team, but it exists today. He told the machine that he was finally seeing the colors of the wind, and the recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of those who have heard humming. We are left with the images and the whispers of a man who chose to. The search is over, but the discovery has only just begun for those who dare look. The mountain remains a giant in the clouds, and it keeps the names of the story ends where it began, in the quiet of the woods and the cold. Silas Vance was a man who understood the language of the forest and the secrets of the forest. He found the door that only opens once, and he decided to walk through to the side. The people of the valley still talk about the winter the earth spoke back in the dark. They tell the story to their children to make sure they stay away from the shortcut today. The memory of the mechanic is a warning that some roads should never be traveled in winter. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the snow covers the truth of what happened in the clearing. We are just the keepers of the records and the tellers of the story today. The journey is over, and the file is closed, and the forest is finally quiet. Good night to the mountain, and to the shortcut, and to the man who found his way. What paramedics discovered after forcing the frozen door, the record-breaking ice storm of 1993 paralyzed the small mountain community of Oak Haven for nearly 10 full days. Local emergency dispatch logs show that a frantic call came in on the morning of January 15th from a neighbor. Harlan Vance was a 64-year-old retired train engineer who lived alone in a remote cabin near the ridge. He was a man of strict habit who always shoveled his walkway and kept his porch light on for safety. On the day the storm finally broke, the neighbor noticed that Harlan's front door was standing wide open to the wind. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, and the inside of the home was reportedly as cold as the woods. Paramedics arrived on the scene and found the front porch covered in a thick and treacherous sheet of solid blue ice. They struggled to gain entry because the heavy oak door had become frozen to the frame in a partially open position. The lead paramedic was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Mountain District for over 15 years total. He used a heavy metal pry bar to force the door open while his partner cleared the snow from the threshold. When they finally stepped inside, they were met with a sight that made them stop and check their own oxygen levels. The entire living room was filled with hundreds of intricate ice sculptures that looked like people frozen in various active poses. There were figures sitting at the wooden table and others standing near the fireplace as if they were warming their hands. Silas noted that the sculptures were incredibly detailed and showed individual facial expressions and even the texture of woven winter clothing. He called out for Harlan, but the only response was the sound of the wind whistling through the broken window panes. The paramedics moved toward the back of the cabin while their heavy boots crunched on the frost-covered hardwood floors. They reached the master bedroom and found Harlan Vance sitting on the edge of his bed with a peaceful look. His skin was pale and cold to the touch, but he did not show the typical signs of advanced stage hypothermia. Silas checked for a pulse and was surprised to find that Harlan's heart was still beating at a very slow rate. The room was freezing, but Harlan was only wearing a light cotton shirt and a pair of old denim work pants. He appeared to be in a deep trance, and his eyes were fixed on a small silver object on the frit. Silas picked up the object and realized it was a handheld voice recorder that was still currently in the mode. He pressed the stop button and then hit the play function to hear what Harlan had been listening to earlier. The recording began with a high-pitched humming sound that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the small cabin. A voice on the tape that sounded exactly like Harlan began to describe the guests who were arriving for dinner party. He spoke to the empty room and introduced each of the ice sculptures as if they were his oldest living friends. Harlan explained to the recorder that the cold was not an enemy, but a bridge to a place without any. He said that the sculptures were not made of water, but were actually the memories of the people he lost. The audio captured the sound of several different voices laughing and talking in the background of the quiet and empty. Silas looked around the room and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside the 20 Seft. He noticed that the ice figures in the living room were slowly beginning to melt as the sun came. The water from the melting sculptures did not soak into the floor, but seemed to vanish into the dry. The paramedics loaded Harlan onto a stretcher and began the difficult trek back down the icy mountain path to the foray. They noticed that the humming sound from the recorder was now coming from the trees that lined the narrow dirt. Silas kept the device in his pocket and felt the vibration spreading through his own chest as they walked along. He looked back at the cabin and saw a figure standing in the doorway that looked like a young. The figure was waving goodbye and holding a small silver object that matched the one found in the bedroom. By the time they reached the ambulance, the humming had stopped and the sun was shining brightly on the. Harlan Vance regained consciousness at the county hospital 2 days later, but he had no memory of the ice. He asked the nurses if his guests had enjoyed the meal and if the music was to their liking. Hospital records show that Harlan's body temperature had been recorded at 62 degrees when he first arrived in the rest. This was a level that should have been fatal for any human being according to modern medical science, and the doctors could not explain how he had survived for days in the sub-zero temperatures without any form of contrast. They also found that his fingerprints had been smoothed over as if they had been polished by a heavy. Silas Thorne visited Harlan in the recovery ward to return the voice recorder and to ask about the ice. Harlan took the device and smiled before telling Silas that some doors are meant to be opened by the Ford. He claimed that the sculptures were still there and were just waiting for the next deep freeze to return. The local authorities investigated the cabin but found no evidence of any foul play or any other people involved. The ice sculptures had completely vanished by the time the sheriff reached the property on the afternoon of the quote. There were no water stains on the floorboards, and the furniture was dry and free of any winter. The only thing they found was a set of footprints in the frost that led into a solid. The footprints were small and appeared to belong to a child who was not wearing any shoes or... Silas Thorne resigned from his position as a paramedic 3 months after the events at the Ridge Cabin. He moved to a warmer climate and told his friends that he could no longer stand the sound. The mystery of what happened inside that cabin remains a topic of conversation among the long-term residents of. Some believe that the storm created a rift in time that allowed Harlan to see into his own. Others think that the isolation and the extreme cold caused a shared hallucination between the two responding medical. However, the recording on the silver device was analyzed by a professional audio engineer in the nearby city. He found that the background voices were not human, but were constructed from the frequencies of the howling mountain. The humming was found to match the resonant frequency of the granite bedrock that sits beneath the entire valley. This evidence suggests that the cabin was located on a unique spot where the earth itself can store. Harlan Vance lived for another 10 years in a quiet assisted living facility near the coast of the... He never spoke of the ice again, but he always kept his room at a very cold 30. He passed away during a minor winter storm in 2003 while listening to his old silver. The cabin on the ridge was eventually torn down in 2010 to make way for a new. Workers reported that the ground beneath the foundation was still frozen solid even in the middle of a hot. They found a collection of small silver objects buried in the dirt that looked like ancient coins. Or these items were taken to a local university, but they vanished from the lab before they could be. The story of the frozen door is a reminder that the world holds secrets that we cannot always. We see what we want to see, but the cold has a way of showing us the true. Paramedics are trained to save lives, but that day they found a life that didn't need any saving. Silas Thorne still dreams of the ice people and the way they looked at him in the quiet. The silence of the mountains is a heavy thing that can change a person if they stay too. Most people stay in the town and avoid the high ridges when the clouds begin to turn a... They know that the wind carries more than just snow and that some voices should never be followed. The record of the 1993 storm is a folder in a dusty cabinet that no one... It serves as a warning for those who think they understand the limits of the human body, and the guests are still waiting for the next freeze, and the table is always set for a long. We are just the listeners to a story that started long before we were born in the cold. The door is closed for now, but the ice is always thin, and the mountain is always... The final report from the county coroner was issued in 2004, and it mentioned the slow. He stated that the slow heart rate of Harlan Vance was a physiological anomaly that challenged every known medical. This conclusion was officially filed away, and the case was listed as an unexplained survival event in the crate. The neighbor who called the police eventually moved away because he could still hear the laughing on the... He said that the porch light would turn on by itself every night, even after the power was. These details were never included in the official news reports because they were deemed too strange for the... We are left with the facts of the case and the memories of the men who were. The truth is often buried under the snow and is only revealed when the door is finally... The voicemail that surfaced years later was a message left for Silas Thorne on the night he moved. It was a recording of the humming sound and a brief sentence spoken by a voice he didn't. The voice told him that the sculptures were very happy that he had come to the party that. Silas never played the tape for anyone else, and he destroyed it shortly after he heard the final. He spent his remaining years in the desert, where the sun is always hot and the ground is. He knew that the cold was waiting for him, and he wanted to stay in the light. The story ends here in the quiet of the office where the records are kept and we can only wonder what Harlan saw in the eyes of the ice people and why the mountain knows and the snow remembers and the door is always ready for the next. Harlan's sister claimed that her brother had always been a dreamer who talked to the wind during the dray. She was not surprised by the story of the ice figures, and she said that their mother was. The family history was filled with tales of people who could hear the mountain and who knew this cultural context provides a possible explanation for why Harlan was so calm during the entire strange. The paramedics were just outsiders who stepped into a world that they were not prepared to see or place. The discovery they made was not a crime, but a glimpse into a reality that exists behind the We keep the files and we tell the story, but we do not pretend to know the truth. The ice has its own language, and it speaks to those who are willing to listen in. The cabin site is now a peaceful clearing where the grass grows tall and the birds sing in. There is no sign of the struggle or the frost or the figures that stood in the living. But the air is still a bit colder there than it is in the rest of the Pawnee. Hikers report that their watches stop and their compasses spin when they stand on the spot where they feel a sense of peace and a desire to sit down and rest for a long. The story of the frozen door is a part of the mountain now, and it will always. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple drawing. It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of. What paramedics discovered after forcing the frozen door was a man who had found his way back too. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police. We will remember the name of Harlan Vance and the night the ice came inside to stay for. The wind is picking up again and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks. It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices, and the story is finished and the narrator is tired and the lights are starting to fade. Good night to the valley and to the ridge and to the people who are still waiting. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake. The steep limestone cliffs above the northern shoreline remained untouched for decades until a heavy storm uncovered a buried secrets. Records from 1974 describe a geological survey that went missing during a sudden and violent spring thaw event. Elias Vance was a 52-year-old field technician who had spent 20 years mapping the shifting coastal ranges. He was a practical man who understood the language of the earth and the way the rocks moved in the models. On a Tuesday in early April, Elias arrived at the remote base camp to finish his final set of readings. The wind was already picking up speed as he carried his heavy recording equipment down toward the deep canyon floor. He noticed a strange warmth coming from the center of the ravine, which defied the freezing air of the mountain. Elias knelt down to examine the granite slabs and found a hidden copper wire tucked into a corner of the. He pulled the wire with all his strength and watched as a small section of the earth shifted to a narrow staircase made of packed dirt led even further down into the darkness beneath the original floor of the. Elias felt a sense of duty to ensure the data was accurate, so he climbed down with a dim electric. The air down there was thick with the scent of old parchment and something sweet like honey or very ripe. He reached the bottom and found himself in a circular room lined with shelves made of polished black volcanic river. Hundreds of small metal canisters were arranged in perfect rows, and each one was sealed with a thick layer of. Elias picked up a canister and felt a rhythmic vibration that pulsed against his calloused palms like a tiny heart. He heard a faint sound that resembled a distant choir singing a melody he had not heard since his early. The storm outside intensified and buried the canyon entrance under a massive drift of heavy and wet mountain snow. For local dispatch logs from that week indicate that the base camp manager reported Elias missing after his truck was found. Search parties could not reach the building until the following Monday, when the winds finally died down and the sun. They found the canyon door wide open, but the main storage area was completely empty and silent in the winter. A deputy noticed the shifted floor slab and followed the dirt steps down into the hidden chamber beneath the canyon. He found Elias sitting on the floor, surrounded by dozens of broken metal canisters that were leaking a strange blue. The technician was staring at the ceiling and whispering a list of names that had been forgotten by the local. His tools were scattered across the dirt floor, and his lantern had run out of power many hours before they. Witness statements from the rescue team mentioned that the blue mist seemed to move against the wind like it was. The air in the hidden room was reportedly so hot that the men began to sweat despite the freezing outdoor. Elias refused to leave the circle of broken jars and claimed he was finally listening to the voices of the D. He told the deputy that the canisters held the final frequency of every person who had died in the valley. The archives of the Geological Survey did not contain any mention of a secondary basement or a collection of canisters. Investigators found a leather-bound ledger on one of the black stone shelves that contained detailed entries from 1840. The handwriting matched a previous surveyor who had been removed from the project for practicing forbidden and strange acoustic rituals. Each entry described a process of capturing a person's final resonance inside a vessel to preserve their spirit for. The local doctor examined Elias and found that his hearing had become supernaturally sensitive to the point of causing him. He could hear conversations happening in the town square miles away and describe the sound of the grass growing under. The authorities were unable to explain how the metal canisters had remained hidden and active for over 100 years. They decided to remove Elias from the room by force because he was showing signs of extreme mental and physical. As they carried him up the dirt stairs, the blue mist followed them like a shadow until they reached the priest watched as the mist dissipated into the cold winter air and the sound of the singing, finally. Elias never returned to his work as a field technician and spent his remaining years living in total and absolute. He claimed that the world was too loud now that he had heard the true voice of the mountain. The survey board met in secret during the first week of May to discuss the future of the remote. They decided that the risk of the hidden chamber was too great for the staff to handle during the winter. A crew of workers was hired from a different county to ensure that the details of the room remained private. They poured 10 tons of industrial concrete into the hidden staircase until the room was completely filled from floor to... The workers then sealed the metal wire under a new layer of reinforced limestone and bolted the canyon door shut. No one was allowed to enter the lower level of the ravine for any reason for the next 40 years. The official reason given to the public was that the area had become dangerously unstable due to the heavy spring. However, the people who lived nearby reported hearing a faint humming sound coming from the ground during every major coastal. A final report from a structural engineer in 1995 noted that the concrete had developed strange and glowing. He suggested that the material was reacting to a thermal source deep underground that should not exist in that zone. The site was eventually decommissioned and the land was sold to a private trust that keeps the property strictly. Some believe the canisters were not just holding sounds, but were acting as a seal for something much older and... The voicemail Elias Thorne left for his sister on the night he disappeared is still kept in a secure police. He sounded happy on the recording and told her that he was finally learning how to truly listen to the canyon remains a tomb of concrete and secrets that the town has agreed to leave alone in the time. It is a quiet reminder that some parts of history are better left buried deep beneath the heavy mountain. The archived recording revealed a fatal mistake made by the original surveyors who first entered the deep and dark mountain. They had inadvertently tapped into a natural resonance that the human mind was never meant to hear or to fully... The tape captured the sound of the earth opening up and the voices of 1,000 years calling out in. Elias had not found a treasure, but had stumbled into a biological trap that was designed to consume the curious. The recording ends with the sound of a heavy door closing and the final words of a man who, He realized too late that the jars were not empty, but were waiting for a fresh soul to fill the... The tragedy of the Vance family became a cautionary tale for every new technician who was assigned to the Northern. They were told to never dig too deep and to always listen for the humming that precedes a major event. Today, the canyon is a restricted zone, and the Forest Service keeps a constant watch over the site of the tomb. The concrete has held for now, but the heat continues to rise from the depths of the Black Volcanic River. People in the town still talk about the man who could hear the grass grow and who knew the Ben. They wonder if he is still out there in the silence of his room, listening to the voices of... The archived recording is a silent witness to the power of the earth and the mistakes of the brave. We are left with the cold facts and the mystery of the canisters that still pulse in the dark. The story of Elias Thorne is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the deep, and the journey into the white is a path that leads to a place where time has no more meaning. The final page of the ledger was translated in 2005, and it contained a warning for the next. It stated that the earth has a memory, and it does not like to be disturbed by the noise of. Those who seek the truth must be prepared to pay the price with their own silence and their own. Elias paid that price, and he found the peace that he had been looking for since he was a... We can only hope that the concrete holds and that the jars remain buried in the dark of the pos. The archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that can never be undone by the hands of any living human. The mountain remains a giant in the clouds, and it keeps the names of the lost and the found. The story ends here, in the quiet of the office, where the records are kept and the lights. The silence of the Northern Range is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave the woods. Most people do not spend enough time in the trees to understand the way the light changes on the... Silas was a man who knew every trail and every stream, but he did not know the mountains heavy. He was a part of the forest, and in the end, the forest decided to keep him for its... The church basement and the seismic bunker and the maintenance shed are all connected by the same dark heavy. They are places where the rules of the world seem to thin out and let the other side lean. The story of the technician who ignored the warning is a story of a man who found home. It is a quiet reminder that the world is much bigger than we are, and it has its... We keep the files and we tell the story, but we do not pretend to know the true final. The ice has its own language, and it speaks to those who are willing to listen in the... The cabin site is now a peaceful clearing where the grass grows tall and the birds sing in. There is no sign of the struggle or the frost or the figures that stood in the living. But the air is still a bit colder there than it is in the rest of the mountain. Hikers report that their watches stop and their compasses spin when they stand on the spot where the cabin. They feel a sense of peace and a desire to sit down and rest for a long time. The story of the archived recording is a part of the mountain now, and it will always stay. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple drawing of the dog. It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of mountain. What Elias discovered after forcing the frozen door was a man who had found his way back to the day. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the winter. The mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police station. We will remember the name of Elias Vance and the night the blue mist came inside to stay. The wind is picking up again, and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks of day. It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices and its own... The story is finished, and the narrator is tired, and the lights are starting to fade out now. Good night to the valley and to the ridge and to the people who are still waiting in the... The cold truth remains buried beneath the ice and the stone and the memory of the man who heard. We are just the listeners to an echo of a life that was taken by the wind and snow. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place where he finally found Dare. The warning was real and the cost was his life, but he seems to have found a final. We will keep the records safe, and we will remember the name of the man who walked into The forest is waiting for the next winter to clear so it can show us something new and... The story of Elias Thorne is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the deep. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that changed the history of the entire Northern Valley for everyone. The truth is often colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. The final GPS trail of 4 winter travelers, the high mountain corridors of the Northern Cascades, are notoriously difficult to navigate during the peak of the winter season. Search and rescue logs from 1998 describe a case where a digital breadcrumb trail led to a dead end. Silas Thorne was a 46-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who was hired to transport a specialized logging crew. He spent his years maintaining diesel engines and knew exactly how to handle a 4-wheel drive truck in deep snow. On a cold morning in late January, Silas gathered his 3 passengers and began the long climb up the ridge. He planned to reach the timber camp by sunset and had programmed the route into his early model dash navigation unit. The first flakes of snow began to fall as they pulled away from the main highway and entered the dense forest. He checked his emergency gear and told the crew that the weather was shifting faster than the morning radio report predicted. Silas gripped the steering wheel as the wind picked up and started pushing the heavy vehicle toward the icy road shoulder. The visibility dropped to near zero within minutes as the world outside the windshield turned into a blinding wall of white. He noticed that the GPS unit began to flicker and display coordinates that were located hundreds of miles to the south. This was confusing because the device was receiving a strong satellite signal and the sky above them was relatively clear. Silas slowed the truck to a crawl and tried to find the familiar landmarks that guided him through the narrow pass. He saw a faint, shimmering light coming from behind a thick stand of ancient cedar trees just a few yards ahead. When he pulled over to investigate, he found a small maintenance shed that he had never noticed in 20 years. The building was covered in a layer of frost, but the metal door felt strangely warm to his bare hand. The 4 men stepped out into the freezing wind, while the snow quickly filled their heavy leather work boots and jackets. Silas grabbed his flashlight and led the way toward the wooden structure, while his breath came in short and ragged gasps. He forced the door open and was surprised to find a working landline telephone and a small kerosene heater inside. The crew huddled around the warmth while Silas picked up the receiver and heard a very clear and rhythmic humming. He dialed the local dispatch center to report their location and the strange malfunction of the electronic navigation equipment they used. Dispatch logs from that night show that Silas made a call at exactly 7:42 in the evening, according to clock. The recording captured him explaining that the GPS was showing them moving in a perfect circle even though they were stationary. The operator told him to stay inside and wait for the plow crews to reach the summit by the morning. Silas agreed, but his voice became quiet as he described a rhythmic tapping sound on the outside of the wooden walls. He told the operator that the red lights he saw through the window were circling the building at high speed. The call ended abruptly with a loud static burst that the phone company could never explain using standard technical terms. Search teams were unable to reach the isolated area for 3 full days due to the record-breaking snow accumulation. When the first responders finally reached the maintenance shed, they found the door was bolted shut from the inside with heavy. They had to use a crowbar to break the lock, and they were shocked by the scene inside the small. Silas Thorne and his 3 passengers were missing, but the room was filled with their personal belongings and survival gear. The kerosene heater was full of fuel, but it had never been lit during the duration of the long storm. Investigators noted that the temperature inside the shed was far below freezing, but there were no signs of a struggle. They found the GPS unit sitting on the desk, and it was still displaying the final trail of the 4 travelers. The digital map showed that the truck had traveled over 500 miles in a single hour across the mountain peaks. This was physically impossible for any land vehicle, and there were no tracks in the deep snow surrounding the entire building. They found a small notebook on the desk with a final entry written in a hand that was not Silas. The message stated that the passengers had arrived and the vehicle was now ready for the long journey back home. Local detectives were baffled by the lack of evidence and the strange nature of the final recording from dispatch center. They checked the maintenance logs and found that the shed had been disconnected from the phone grid for 10 years. Witness statements from a plow driver added a new layer of mystery to the case of the missing logging crew. The driver claimed he saw a massive shape moving through the trees that looked like a bus with no windows. It moved silently through the forest and left no tracks in the fresh powder, despite its apparent size and weight. The sheriff department eventually closed the file and listed the cause of disappearance as undetermined due to the strange circumstances. Silas Thorne was never found, but his truck was recovered from a ravine that was located 20 miles from the. Technicians examined the vehicle and found that the engine had been melted from the inside by an intense thermal source. There was no fire damage to the exterior of the truck, and the fuel tank was still completely full of. The mystery of the final GPS trail continues to haunt the people who travel that stretch of mountain highway. A local historian discovered a series of old photographs in the basement of the town library 2 years ago during. One image showed the maintenance shed shortly after it was built in the early 1950s by the local government. Standing in the background was a tall figure dressed in a dark suit that did not fit the winter setting. The figure appeared to be holding a device that looked remarkably like the GPS unit Silas had used that night. There was no name attached to the photograph, and the photographer had died shortly after the image was captured on. This evidence sparked a new interest in the case, but no official investigation was ever reopened by the state police. The town has since moved the highway slightly to avoid the ridge where the crew disappeared so many years. People still avoid that area when the first signs of a heavy snowstorm begin to appear on the horizon. The shed was eventually torn down in 2008 after a group of hikers reported hearing phones ringing inside. They said the sound was high and clear, even though there was no power running to the remote mountain site. When the demolition crew arrived, they found the floorboards had been etched with strange symbols and long rows of numbers. The numbers corresponded to the coordinates of every major disappearance that had hit the region over the last half-century. The final set of numbers on the list matched the location where the truck was found in the deep. This discovery led to many theories about the way storms might act as a bridge between two different eras. The wood from the shed was burned on site, and the ashes were buried deep beneath the frozen earth. No one wanted to take the materials back to town for fear of bringing the shadows with them today. You can still hear the humming of the old phone lines if you stand in the clearing during a quiet. The sound is soft and rhythmic, like the tapping Silas heard before he was taken away into the whiteout winds. Most people prefer to stay in the warmth of their homes while the mountain peaks are hidden by the peat. They know that the things that move in the snow are not always looking for a way back home. The story of Silas Thorne remains a quiet warning to anyone who thinks they can survive the mountain alone. Some lights are not meant to be followed, and some doors should never be opened in the middle of. The mountain remembers every name, and it keeps them safe within the shadows that car headlights can never reach. The final GPS trail is a reminder that some paths lead to places that cannot be found on maps. The regional supervisor ordered the area around the old shed to be fenced off with heavy chain link and wire. He claimed it was due to soil erosion, but the locals knew that the reason was much more than that. People who live near the base of the mountain say they still hear the humming on their television sets. It happens most often during the last week of January when the air is still and the sun sets. They say it is the sound of Silas Thorne still trying to radio for help from the other side. The mountain keeps its silent vigil over the valley, and the pines whisper the names of those who stayed. If you ever find a compass spinning in circles near a trail, you should turn around and walk away. The warning from the logbook is still true, even if the man who wrote it is no longer here. The final report from the county coroner was issued in 1999 and noted a strange lack of potibit. He stated that the lack of biological traces at the site suggested that the men had simply ceased to. This conclusion was rejected by the state police, who believed that the crew had staged their own strange disappearance. They pointed to the clean bank records and the lack of personal debt as evidence that they were not. However, the sister of Silas claimed that he was a man of high integrity who would never abandon job. She kept the recording from the dispatch center in a safe place and listened to it every single winter. She said that if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a forest fire that never... The mystery remains a part of the local lore that keeps the tourists away from the high mountain ridge. A structural engineer who visited the site in 2010 found that the magnetic field was still highly unstable. He suggested that a massive energy discharge had occurred within the stone foundation during the peak of the storm. Silas Thorne was never buried in the town cemetery, but his name is often whispered by those who fear. The story of the travelers is a reminder that the woods hold secrets that we are not meant to. We build our roads to cross the world, but sometimes the world is watching us from the deep dark. The silence of the forest is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave the present. Sometimes the truth is colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt spray. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple drawing. It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of mountain stone. What the search teams discovered after forcing the frozen door was a man who had found his way back. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the winter logic. The mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police station files. We will remember the name of Silas Thorne and the night the final GPS trail led into the pond. The wind is picking up again, and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks of... It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices and its own. The story is finished, and the narrator is tired, and the lights are starting to fade out now. The cold truth remains buried beneath the ice and the stone and the memory of the man who heard. We are just the listeners to an echo of a life that was taken by the wind, and the voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place where he finally found. The warning was real, and the cost was his life, but he seems to have found a final peace. We will keep the records safe, and we will remember the name of the man who walked into. The forest is waiting for the next winter to clear so it can show us something new, and the story of Silas Thorne is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the deep. This final GPS trail exposed a fatal mistake that changed the history of the entire Northern Valley forever. The cold truth behind this coastal lookout in winter, the concrete observation tower on the jagged northern cliffs, was built in 1942 to guard the freezing shoreline. Local archives from the winter of 1976 describe a season where the sea ice pushed unusually far south. Silas Thorne was a 54-year-old retired lighthouse keeper who lived in a small cottage near the bluff. He was a practical man who understood the shifting tides and the way the salt spray could freeze on metal. On a gray afternoon in late December, Silas noticed the barometer dropping while a thick mist rolled off the water. He planned to walk to the tower to check the structural integrity of the old iron railing for the county. He checked his heavy coat and grabbed a lantern before heading toward the path that led along the steep cliffs. The first flakes of snow began to fall as he reached the heavy steel door at the base of the brain. Silas forced the rusted door open and felt a strange wave of warm air rising from the dark stone stairs. This was confusing because the tower had been abandoned for years and there were no heaters inside the cold structure. He climbed the spiral staircase and noticed that the walls were covered in a thin layer of pulsing green moss. The air smelled like ozone and wet copper, and he heard a low humming sound that made his teeth ache. He reached the observation deck and saw that the glass windows were completely frosted over with thick and white ice. Silas moved to the center of the room and found a small wooden chair sitting perfectly in the middle floor. A heavy brass telescope was mounted on a tripod, and it was pointed directly at a spot on the horizon. He looked through the lens and saw a massive dark shape moving slowly through the ice and the freezing. The shape did not resemble any ship or submarine that Silas had ever seen during his long years at sea. It looked like a floating island made of black stone that was surrounded by a ring of flickering red lights. Silas reached for his radio to alert the Coast Guard, but the device only produced a loud and steady static. The humming sound grew louder until the entire tower began to vibrate and the green moss started to glow brighter. He felt a sudden pressure in his chest, and his vision blurred as the red lights on the horizon expanded. Silas looked back at the telescope and saw that the dark shape was now much closer to the shoreline cliffs. He realized that the humming was coming from the stone beneath his feet and not from the winter wind outside. The door to the observation deck slammed shut, and he found himself locked inside the small and freezing room. The blizzard lasted for 5 days and buried the coastline under 4 feet of heavy and salt-crusted white snow. Search teams finally reached the tower on the morning of January 2nd to look for the missing retired lighthouse keeper. They found the steel door at the base was welded shut from the inside with a material that resisted saws. When they eventually breached the room, they found Silas Thorne sitting in the wooden chair with his eyes closed tight. The room was incredibly hot, and the air was filled with the smell of scorched earth and old seawater. Investigators noted that Silas was holding a small notebook that contained a single sentence written over and over again. The message stated that the Watchers were back and that the cold was only a mask for the fire. They found his lantern on the floor, but the fuel had been replaced with a thick and glowing silver. The local authorities took the notebook to the station to see if it held any clues about the event there. The handwriting matched Silas exactly, but the language used was a dialect that had not been spoken for centuries nearby. A recording device found in his pocket captured the sound of the wind and a deep and rhythmic metal. The audio revealed a voice that sounded like Silas, but the tone was mechanical and lacked any human emotional quality. The voice claimed that the tower was a beacon for the travelers who were waiting beneath the dark winter. It mentioned that the stone was waking up and that the sea ice was a shield for the emerging heat. The search team found no footprints around the tower except for the single set leading to the heavy steel. The local coroner ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but he could not explain the internal. The coastal lookout was eventually demolished in 1981 after several other residents reported seeing red lights in the. No one could ever explain how the tower had become so hot during the coldest week of the recorded century. Technicians verified that the earth beneath the foundation had been melted and then refrozen into a glass-like black. Some locals believe the tower was built on top of an ancient site that was older than the church. Others think Silas had found a way to communicate with something that lived deep beneath the cold and dark. The mystery of the glowing moss and the silver fuel was never solved by any state or federal agency. It remains a story told by those who remember the winter the cliffs began to hum in the dark. The observation tower is gone, but the feeling of being watched still remains for those who walk. A retired deputy discovered a series of photographs in the attic of the old courthouse 3 years ago during renovations. One image showed Silas Thorne standing on the deck of the tower a few hours before the storm hit hard. In the background of the photo, a massive shadow can be seen rising from the water near the coastal. The shadow had several glowing ports that matched the location of the red lights described in the old reports. There was no ship registered in the area that matched the size or the strange shape of the dark. This evidence suggests that Silas was not alone when he entered the tower to check the old iron railing. The town has since placed a warning sign near the path to discourage hikers from approaching the cliff edge. People still report hearing a low hum during the winter months when the sea ice begins to form. The ground where the tower once stood remains barren, and no plants will grow there despite the rich coastal soil. Structural engineers who visited the site in 2010 found that the magnetic field was still highly unstable. They suggested that a massive energy discharge had occurred within the stone foundation during the peak of the storm event. Silas Thorne was buried in the town cemetery, but his name is often whispered by those who fear the dawn. The story of the lookout is a reminder that the ocean holds secrets that we are not meant to. We build our towers to watch the world, but sometimes the world is watching us from the deep dark. The silence of the cliffs is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave the... Sometimes the truth is colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. The voicemail Silas left for his sister was the last time anyone heard his natural voice before the search ended. He sounded confused and told her that the horizon was burning with a light that had no heat at. He mentioned that the telescope was showing him a city that was built out of ice and black stone. The recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of the people who still live in the... It is a voice from the center of a blizzard that should have been silenced by the cold wind. We are left with the empty cliffs and the memory of a man who saw too much there. The journey into the white is a journey that everyone must take when the signal is finally right. The shadows are just waiting for the next deep freeze so they can show us the way. The truth is buried deep, and the mountain is silent, and the sea keeps its own dark secret. Today, the lookout is just a memory and a few scattered pieces of concrete on the jagged and sharp. No one goes up there during the winter months, and the birds have stopped nesting in the nearby trees. The mountain sits in the mist and waits for the next person to ignore the warnings of the wind. The cycle of the snow and the wind and the lights continues as it has for many years. The memory of Silas Thorne is a ghost in the records and a whisper in the cold salt. Sometimes the things we find on the cliffs are just the things we left behind a long time. The journey into the white is a path that leads to a place where time has no pass. The shadows are waiting for the light to fade so they can show you the truth of the lookout is gone, but the watchers are still there in the deep and freezing and silent. Why locals refuse to use this forest shortcut in January? The narrow dirt road cutting through the northern timberlands has remained officially closed during the winter months since 1984. Local records from the County Road Commission indicate that the route was abandoned after a series of unexplained mechanical failures. Silas Vance was a 48-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who lived in a small cabin near the forest edge. He was a practical man who understood the limits of a diesel engine and the dangers of the mountain snow. On a freezing afternoon in late January, Silas decided to use the restricted forest shortcut to reach a stranded client. He checked his emergency gear and grabbed a heavy wool blanket before starting his loud truck in the fading light. The first flakes of snow began to fall as he pulled off the main highway and onto the dirt path. He knew the shortcut would save him 2 hours of driving if the road remained clear of deep drifts today. Silas gripped the steering wheel as the wind picked up and started pushing the heavy truck toward the icy ditch. The visibility dropped to near zero within minutes as the world outside the windshield turned into a blinding wall of... He noticed that his radio was only producing a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the dashboard panel. This was confusing because he was well within range of the local station and his antenna was still intact, and Silas slowed the truck to a crawl and tried to find the familiar landmarks that guided him through the dents. He saw a faint, shimmering light coming from behind a thick stand of ancient pine trees just a few yards. When he pulled over to investigate, he found a small iron gate that he had never noticed in 20 years. The gate was covered in a layer of frost, but it felt strangely warm to his bare and calloused. He pushed the gate open and found a narrow path that led down into a small valley hidden from the profess. Silas felt a sense of curiosity and followed the trail while he held his lantern high to see the way. The air in the valley was thick with the scent of pine needles and something sweet like very ripe fruit. He reached the bottom and found himself in a circular clearing filled with dozens of antique glass jars on shelves. Each jar contained a swirling gray mist that seemed to pulse in time with the low humming sound heard earlier. Silas reached out to touch one jar and heard a muffled voice speaking his name from inside the thick. The voice sounded exactly like his father, who had been missing since the great blizzard of 1952 today. Silas backed away in terror, but the path behind him had suddenly vanished under a massive and heavy snowdrift. The storm lasted for 6 days and kept the town residents trapped inside their homes while the snow piled. When the roads were finally cleared, the local priest went to the woods to check on the missing heavy. He found the truck idling near the iron gate, but there was no sign of Silas in the main. The search party noticed the small gate, which was now standing wide open and glowing with a soft blue. They entered the hidden valley and found Silas sitting on the floor, staring at a single empty glass jar today. His hair had turned completely white, and he was unable to speak or recognize any of his old friends. The investigators noted that the temperature inside that small hidden clearing was exactly 72 degrees, despite the blizzard. They also found a tape recorder on the shelf that had been running for the entire 6-day period. The local authorities took the tape to the station to see if it captured any clues about the event. The recording began with the sound of Silas breathing heavily as he struggled with the frozen iron gate initially today. Then the humming sound grew louder until it drowned out the noise of the wind howling outside the forest shortcut. Dozens of different voices began to speak at once, and they all seemed to be reciting local town history secrets. They spoke of births and deaths and secrets that had been buried in the valley for over 100. The most disturbing part of the audio was the sound of a large crowd cheering in the quiet background. It sounded as if the small forest clearing was actually a massive stadium filled with thousands of invisible people. The recording ended with a single clear sentence spoken by a voice